Wabarakatuh. Okay, so how many people here have heard me mention the name of today's history maker already? You did, right? Yes. Okay. No one else. Okay, all right. So those who have not heard it, this is only a guessing game for them. So he is considered to be the father of modern economics. And of course, he's a Muslim. He is considered to be the father of sociology. And he's considered to be the father of historiography, which is how to study historical writings. Any guesses? Okay, so his most famous work is the introduction. If I say the introduction in Arabic, you will get it. Ibn Khaldun, yes. And what is it in Arabic? Al-Muqaddimah, right? Al-Muqaddimah. So Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah, now he was not necessarily a big scholar type. Okay, his contribution is not necessarily in Islamic sciences, while even though he was trained and he memorized the Qur'an at an early age and he was very well aware and knowledgeable in Islamic sciences, but his contribution actually came in, you could say, dealing with people and studying that and writing about it. So his name is Abdurrahman ibn Muhammad, and it's basically a long name as Arabs usually have. So Abdurrahman ibn Muhammad, ibn Abi Bakr, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, ibn Khaldun al-Hadrami. So anybody knows where Ibn Khaldun was born? What is that? Andalus. South. Yes. North Africa, yes. So he was actually born in Tunis, Tunisia, in 1332. And you are actually right, but the reason why you're not right is because in his parents' generation, the Christians, they were basically making a very hard effort trying to conquer those areas. So many of the people who were able to get out, they crossed over to North Africa, just across the Straits of Gibraltar. So Ibn Khaldun's parents were born in Andalus, but he was born in Tunis because they felt that it was the time to get out, because as you know, that this battle between the Christians trying to retake Andalus, the Muslim Spain and Portugal and this area, this is something that lasted over 200 years. Okay, campaigns after campaigns. Sometimes they get some victory. Sometimes Muslims push them back. It keeps going back until eventually in 1492, this was all over, and Queen Isabella and Ferdinand basically officially took over the whole thing, and there was nothing more left at that time. So during the time just before Ibn Khaldun was born, a lot of the scholars, a lot of the influential people, and usually those are the people that can afford to pick up and leave, right? When you see that there's some sort of attack, some sort of persecution coming, unfortunately the poor people, they get crushed because they don't have the resources. Think about India right now. That, in India, the drums of genocide are being beaten. However, those who are a bit more affluent, those who have some more connections, they are the ones that are going to be able to get out. And unfortunately, the poor people who may not even have a passport, they will be the ones that will get stuck. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them. Unfortunately, what ends up happening at the end of the day is that either they basically get beaten into subjugation. Eventually, they get beaten into subjugation, and they are usually, in these type of situations, they are forced to convert to whatever they want them to convert to. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our brothers and sisters. As you know that when the conquistadors took over Spain and Portugal, for a while Muslims remained in secret. They remained Muslim in secret, but openly they had to profess Christianity. However, as you know that if you're not doing it openly, if you're not able to teach your kids, if you're not able to have any Islamic literature, you can't have the Qur'an at home, how long will you be able to hold on? Your next generation will definitely be more on the other side, and probably by third, fourth generation, they will hardly remember anything about Islam. So Ibn Khaldun's parents, they come over to Tunis, and they come and they set up here. Now his family was a very, you could say, influential family. They were involved in high-level administrative positions with the governments throughout their time for several centuries. So they were, as soon as they came over, the people recognized them. Think about when, a famous scientist comes over from another country, a famous, person of any type, they come over. Usually the other countries say, you know what, he's now here, let's take advantage and put them to work. So Ibn Khaldun is he's given, his father is given positions of some sort of administrative rule in the government in Tunis. He writes in his own autobiography, he says that he was of the Arab descent. So although his family came from Andalus, but deep down they came from Yemen, and he claims that one of his great ancestors was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. So the person who actually wrote this, he said that if you know Arabs, every Arab claims that his great-great-grandfather was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, which is, it could be true, it could also be disputed. In the case of Ibn Khaldun, there are others that have disputed his lineage going back to the companion of the Prophet. But again, it doesn't matter as long as 2 or 3 generations down the road, they were all Muslim and they lived in that and they honored that commitment, then there's no problem in that. In Tunis, his family was treated very well by the Hafsid dynasty, and his father became an important administrator of the city until he eventually quit and committed his life to Islamic studies and letters. Now, I wasn't sure exactly, there was a mention of him being in the service of letters. Perhaps in those times, letters were it was a bit more complicated than that because everyone doesn't know how to read and write. Only a few people do. So those people who do, there are sort of specialists who are basically, so the king, and even today, by the way, they have this, is that when a message comes from another government, it doesn't directly come from president to president generally, but rather there are secure channels. In order to make sure that it is accurate, it has to come through those secure channels. And in those secure channels, there are different codes that they have been put in order to make sure that hackers are not able to manipulate. For example, the president of Russia is sending a message to the president of the United States. And if somebody wants to create war between them, they kind of mess up a word or two that could send the wrong message. So there was some sort of work that his father was involved in. However, both his parents died when he was only a teenager, maybe 16, 17 years old. So if he was born in 1332, and both of his parents died around 1348, 49, does anybody know what was a major event that took place in the world at that time? Anybody? An event that killed tens of millions of people all over the world. What is that? The Second World War is going to happen about 800 years later. The First World War will happen about 800 years later as well. Between them is only like 30, 40 years. And they both happen in the 20th century. This is going back to the 14th century. I'm sure all of you have heard about it. Yes. I can't hear you. Yes, the bubonic plague, okay? What is called the Black Death. The Black Death, it spread all over, and as you know that it killed millions and millions of people. And this is something that also took the lives of the parents of Ibn Khaldun while he was only 17 or 18 years old. However, since his family had a long legacy, he was not someone who kind of became an orphan, so to speak, but rather he was a very privileged orphan, so to speak. He was not a minor at this time, anyways. So he continues, and he has a lot of connections with other senior scholars that had also come over from Andalus, and he studied a lot of sciences through those people. He studies Quran. He studies Arabic, linguistics. He studies classical Islamic studies and memorizes the Quran at an early age. He also studies mathematics, philosophy, and he studies the works of people like Ibn Rushd, Al-Razi, and Ibn Sina. Now, he was you could imagine that if you are coming from somewhat of a ministerial family, what is your interest likely to be? What do you think? If your father was minister, your grandfather was minister, it's very likely that you are also going to want to be a minister as well, right? So he was an ambitious person, and he was involved in politics. And he actually wrote in his autobiography, which is called At-Ta'rif, or getting to know Ibn Khaldun. He writes his own version of Game of Thrones. You know the show called Game of Thrones, where there's so much political rivalry in the court of the king that everybody is scheming against everybody. So he actually wrote that this is exactly what's happening in his time, and he's witnessing, and he's saying this guy is doing this guy is doing that. And you will see this in the life of Ibn Khaldun, that he goes up and down several times. At the age of 20, he becomes a seal bearer in the government of Ibn Tafarkin, the ruler of Tunisia at the time. But early on, the government, soon after he takes over this position, the government is toppled, and he's basically out of a job. Ibn Khaldun and his tutor, they left Tunis for Fez, Morocco, and they become a clerk in the court of Marinette. There, he tried to topple his own government that he was in, and he basically ended up on the wrong side. There was an effort to cause a rebellion and to bring the government down, and he was also named as one of the conspirators. So he ends up in jail for about more than a year for some time. However, a year is not a bad thing for the crime that he was accused of committing, considering the times he was living in. So the sultan that had put him in jail dies, and again the regime changes, and he finds himself freed again. So he continues, up and down, this court, this king, that king. Finally, he is given a ministerial job by another Sultan Abu Salim, and he works with him for some time, then falls out with him, then leaves from there. Then he moves to Granada in Spain, in Andalusia, and he starts to work again for the Sultan of Granada. Now, in the government of the Sultan of Granada, there was another, you could say, if there was a copy of Ibn Khaldun, this was a man by the name of Ibn al-Khatib. And he was a minister in that government. And again, they start to have some problems after some time. Although Ibn al-Khatib was the one who got him to come over there, after some time they fall out with each other, and again they start to have problems with each other. And Ibn al-Khatib, Ibn al-Khaldun gets him kicked out of Granada and out of a job again. Okay, where is it? So, So this was at the age of 32 years old, and during this time where he was in the kingdom of Granada working for them, the sultan or the ministers of the sultan, they said, hey, there's a Christian king, his name is Pedro of Castile, and he is currently controlling the area of your ancestors. So we would like you to go and try to negotiate some agreement with him. Let's see what's the best we can get out of it. The Muslims know that they are weak. They are only able to temporarily hold back, but they send Ibn Khaldun to go and negotiate with him as a diplomat. Ibn Khaldun, he goes there and he says that I saw the monuments of my ancestors. Okay, so he starts to see the places where his ancestors had lived. And Pedro, he said, he treated me with utmost generosity and expressed his satisfaction at my presence and showed awareness of the history that he has with his family. And he says that Pedro offers him a job. He says, hey man, you're such an amazing person. I'd like to offer you a job and stay here and work for me. So he says, no, I'm okay, I don't want that. But he accepted a village under his authority from the Sultan of Granada instead. But again, as we said, that Ibn Khatib starts to turn against him, and he is, once more, he found it necessary to leave from there, and he returns to Africa. So again, several times he has moved here, there, here, there, here, there, here, there. So the following 10 years saw him change employers and employment with disconcerting rapidity and move from Bougie to Tlemcen to Biskra to Fez, and I might be messing up the names of these cities, but basically he's all over the place. He's a politician. Anywhere he goes, they recognize his abilities, but at the same time, he's an ambitious person. So he doesn't want to just get a job and sit quietly, but he is involved. And of course, when you are an active participant in politics, what happens? Sometimes you lose, a lot of times. Sometimes you win, a lot of times you lose, okay? So you go in and out of jail, you get threatened with execution. All of those things are happening to Ibn Khaldun as well. At one point, he even served as prime minister and in several other administrative capacities, and he did a bunch of stuff basically as a diplomat. However, at some point, Ibn Khaldun, he just gets sick and tired of, what you would call snakery, right? Being a snake. Like if you are in a royal court, everybody wants to become sultan. And if he can't become the sultan, so his main goal is that I want to get rid of this guy and I want to sit in that seat. But until that happens, I want to become closest person to him, okay? So think about like hypocrisy of the ultimate level, where you're sucking up to the guy that you wish to be killed and you become the ruler in his place. This is unfortunately how politics tends to be in a lot of places. So he says, you know what, okay, I'm sick and tired of this. I need a break. So he starts to just retire from everything. And he's still young at this point. He's probably in his 30s at the time. And he decides to write a book. And he decides to write just the introduction, and it took him about 6 months to write this introduction, Al-Muqaddimah. And this is basically the famous book of Ibn Khaldun. And in this book, he writes about a number of things. So I'll tell you the subjects, the sciences that find its seed in Al-Muqaddimah, and no one before him has spoken about them. Number one is historiography, which is the study of historical writings. And one of the things he said, look, whenever you're reading a history, something that's pretty common and standard for us, but in that time, people didn't look at it that way. He said, you have to look at who is the person who's writing it and what is his bias, okay? Because there's a lot of propaganda that is done, and people will write only their side of the story. So you can't take historical writings at face value. You have to take them with a huge grain of salt, and you have to figure out what are the biases that this person has. And this is something that we have until today, where if you read about, for example, if you just look at two different news channels, One of them is a Democratic-leaning channel. One of them is a Republican-leaning channel. The same event will happen. And both of them will spin it in completely different ways. If you remember, for example, when there was a Chinese balloon that was floating over United States, okay? The pro-Democrat news channels, they said, well, the president was so concerned about bringing any harm to civilians that might be living on the ground, that what they did was they basically cut all communications between that balloon and anyone else. And they waited until it was in a safe area where it was okay to shoot it down. The other side, they said that how can you let a spy device of a foreign government, which is basically gearing up to be our main enemy, how can you allow their balloon to enter from one side and go all the way across to the other side? Couldn't you have shot it down somewhere in the middle? Wasn't there any empty space that you could find, right? So basically, one of them, they said a complete success. One of them said complete failure. So Ibn Khaldun, he says, look, anytime you read historical writings, you need to understand that there is a bias, and you need to understand that these things are going to be there. You have to figure things out. You can't just take it at face value. Second, he talks about sociology, and this is where he writes some amazing observations that he has seen. And subhanAllah, all of his up and down in political courts, he gets to deal with lots and lots of people. So one thing that we can see from him is that he's a very observant person. He's a very observant person. So he says that one of his main ideas in Al-Muqaddimah is that he says, what is the thing that allowed us to be different from animals? What is it that allowed us to be different from animals and other species that are living on this planet? What do you think? What do you think? Speech. Where does speech come from? Brain, right? So he says that it's the intellect. He says our ability to think and reflect on what we are thinking. Okay? The fact that we are thinking and we know that I'm thinking and I'm thinking about this thing, it allows us to actually say, okay, well, you know what? Each time I throw a rock straight up, it comes back and hits me on my head. Okay? So this leads us to say, well, you know what? I need to throw it over there instead of throwing it straight up, right? That's a small little progress. Then that we keep doing that until we say, okay, well, if I want to hit that thing, I have to hit it that high, I have to hit it that fast, I have to do all of this. So as a result, human species is able to become distinct from the brutish existence of the other species. He also notes that, very interesting observation, he says that the climate of a place affects the attitude of the people. So places where climate is extreme, you will see the people are rash and they are basically ready to snap. And places where the climate is very, very comfortable, the people tend to be more calm, they tend to be more wise, and they tend to be more productive in terms of intellectual productivity. Like, you know, they're thinking, they're not just trying to survive due to the extremes of the climate. So of course, these things, they have huge implications down the road that people are able to study where cities develop, why civilizations rise, why civilizations fall. He said, in a clash of titans, when you have two superpowers coming together to fight with each other, what is the rule that will allow one of them to be victorious over the other? So he studies that and he says that if there is no strong determination and energy in the hearts of the people, basically the morale is what he's talking about. He says that if you don't have morale, you're going to lose. If you have morale, you may lose the battle, but you will win the war. Right? And if you think about with regards to the Muslim armies fighting against the Romans and the Persians, okay, what they had was The Muslim armies didn't have advanced weaponry, they did not have huge numbers, but what they had was morale. While the other side, they had weapons, they had numbers, but they lacked morale. But eventually, you're going to keep knocking against them and you're going to lose. And this is something that is repeated all throughout history, where the people who are actually energized to fight, they will continue to fight until victory comes to them. So he says, to avoid defeat, the leaders of these early organizations had to lift the spirits of their members, put their oratory skills to the test, and push themselves beyond the limits by not doubting the cause as righteous. Okay? So inshallah, if we could please motivate our kids to play outside, that would be great. So he says that so as you know that every time when there's a battle, the leaders, they say that this is a righteous battle. Okay? This is the battle between good and evil. And if we don't fight, the side of good is going to lose. So that's how they have to basically pump up the soldiers. But if it's a false narrative, eventually the people start to see, and this narrative starts to go out. The morale starts to leave, and the army starts to lose. Another science that he lays the foundations for is demography, which is the study of statistics such as births, death, income, incidence of diseases, and which illustrates the changing structure of human populations. So he's basically studying these type of things, and as you know that today, many of the Muslim countries in the world, they have a very, very high birth rate. And the majority of the population is under 25 years old. And many of the European countries, which were the leading powers during the colonial times, their birth rates are so low that they're basically going to go into negative, or if they have not already gone into negative. And they don't have any young people, all they have is old people, because maybe 40, 50 years ago, people started to decide to only have 1 or 2 kids. And then those 1 or 2 kids, if they stayed in the country, they only have 1 or 2 kids. And as you know, mashallah, the Muslim family, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids minimum. So basically what's happening is that the Muslim world is actually full of young people with energy. If only there was a leadership that was able to put that in the right direction, put that energy that youthful energy in the right direction, so much could be achieved. So much could be achieved. However, all of that energy is wasted. Another big foundation that he lays in this Muqaddimah is economics, okay? And something which is so simple and so straightforward for us today, which is how are prices of goods determined, right? What do you think? Supply and demand. Who was the first person to observe and write about supply and demand? Ibn Khaldun, right? Ibn Khaldun. So, of course, a lot of the people, they credit this theory to Adam Smith. But Adam Smith came several hundred years later, and Ibn Khaldun had written about it before. He talks about the division of labor and how that affects efficiency of the economy, right? So think about, for example, in a simple example, in a family, you have a husband and a wife. Okay, you have a husband and a wife, and in the traditional Islamic family, the division of labor was that, okay, the husband will go out and work and take care of everything outside, and the wife will take care of everything at home. As a result, the husband is really good at what he needs to do, and he is efficient in that, and the wife is really good at what she does. If you ever have to make them switch roles, they're both miserable at that, right? Of course, please don't cancel me. Talking about in really big, broad strokes, that if you have like sometimes I might ask my wife that, hey, can you pay this bill? She's like, who is the bill supposed to go to? I'm like, okay, you see, it's right there. What's the amount? It's right there. Okay, how do you write a check? She's never done this type of stuff, so she doesn't know that type of stuff. But if you give me the kids for a bit too long, you see a few black hair, they're going to be gone too. She's good at what she does, I'm good at what I do, and as a result, we are able to actually be efficient. So earlier on, as you know, that hunter-gatherer society, as they say, that somebody came up with the idea that, hey, if all of us do one of each, we're all being inefficient. But rather, you become good at one thing and just become specialized and do that to the best of your ability, while someone else become good in something else and you do that to the best of your ability. And as a result, we're able to actually achieve greater productivity as opposed to me doing half and half of both and you doing half and half of both. He talks about the principles of economic growth, and he talks about the supply and demand determining the prices of goods. He also talks about some issues with regards to taxes. In this book, all of this is just the introduction, by the way. He also has, so I talked about 4 sciences already, right? Historiography, sociology, demography, economics. 4. It also has Islamic law, biology, alchemy, and political theory. All of this is just the introduction, al-Muqaddimah, of Ibn Khaldun. And all of this was done in only 6 months. 6 months of writing. But subhanAllah, you can imagine that he was a very observant person. And this is a very important lesson for all of us. That, hey, live your life the way you're living, but keep your eyes open and observe. Look for patterns, look for trends. And that's what actually allows us to be able to study and to get ahead in the next generation or the next phase of our existence. Now, towards the last 10 years of his life, he decides to go for Hajj. And he was still in North Africa, and he wanted to leave from there, but it felt, you know how sometimes you are in a situation where if you are kind of like a political rival of someone, they don't even allow you to leave because they want to keep an eye on you. So Ibn Khaldun wants to get out of there, and he says that, look, I want to go for Hajj, so I'd like permission to leave and go to travel to Hajj, to Mecca. So he gets permission, he leaves, and he's never going to return back. This was, Allahu Alam, if this was a legitimate plan or it was just an excuse, but he basically gets out of there. On his way, he stops in Egypt, Alexandria, and he is impressed with Alexandria. At this time, Egypt is under what dynasty? Does anybody know? In around 1400, 1300, late 1300s. Which dynasty is ruling Egypt right now? Not Umayyads, not Fatimids. Dawla al-Ubaidiyah. Anybody else? The slaves, what are they called in Arabic? The Mamluks. Okay? So the Mamluks were the dynasty that defeated who? The Mongols. Okay, the Mamluks were the ones that basically started off the downfall of the Mongols in the Muslim world. Up until that point, there was no one who was able to withstand in their path. But of course, the Mongols were still around, and Mamluks were stable in Egypt. And Ibn Khaldun was very impressed by the stability of the state in Alexandria. And he decides to stay there and becomes a professor and a senior judge in the administration there. And he tries to reform the justice system there. However, in 1384, he is hit with a major calamity. If anybody can figure out, how old would he be in 1384? If he was born in 1332, 52 years old. So at the age of 52, his wife and kids are traveling on a ship, and that ship sinks, and his wife and all of his kids, they all die in that ship, and it obviously takes a huge toll on any person, such a major calamity. And he basically wants to just, you can imagine that such a person doesn't want anything to do with people. They want to just kind of live out quietly and just, you know, it's a very, very serious shock to the system. However, he continues to just be a teacher in madrasas and schools and whatnot. However, in 1400, he was asked by the Sultan to go to Damascus, the Sultan in Egypt, to go to Damascus and negotiate a peace treaty with Tamerlane, okay, Timur as they call him, that he was a very, very vicious person in terms of his brutality, and they were right on the outskirts of Damascus. So the Sultan sends Ibn Khaldun to again go and can you please negotiate something with him. And remember, he had been sent to another previous Christian king before, and he had really gotten good results. So this time he goes to Timur, and he says that he earned the respect of Timur, and he was honored by him, and he managed to convince him to give time to the people before he lays siege. So basically, based on the insistence of Ibn Khaldun, he agrees that, okay, we'll give 3 days, for example, that 3 days, after 3 days, everything is going to shut down. So anybody that wants to leave, just pick up what you have and get out of the city right now. So actually, thousands of lives were saved due to the status and the respect that Ibn Khaldun commanded, because he was such an eloquent and elegant and intellectual, smart, wise person that, we were talking about it today in the Jummah khutbah, that when knowledge comes, then ignorance becomes quiet. When knowledge comes, you cannot ignore the presence of knowledge in the presence of ignorance. So Ibn Khaldun is that person that when he walks into a room, when he opens his mouth, you cannot help but be impressed by, man, who is this guy? So you listen to him, and he's able to convince you, he's able to give you arguments based on facts. He's able to, make you have no other possibility except the one that he's making the case for. So he's able to save many, many thousands of lives as a result of his communication with this Tamerlane. However, he continues to live in Egypt until another 6 years, quietly again, just focusing on teaching. And in 1406, he passes away, and he is buried in Cairo. In 1406, he passes away, and he is buried in Cairo. So, of course, there is a lot more information that I could have gathered, but I did not have enough time to, so I just tried to bring some of the major points. I would say that some of the takeaway points, some of the lessons that we could take from this. In fact, before I do this, how about people tell me what is something that you would take away from the little story that we just heard about this great, famous historical personality. Any lessons that you learned? Anyone? What is that? Articulate, okay. Be articulate, be wise, try to learn so you could become wise and use that wisdom for good things. What else? Any lessons, any takeaways? Any sisters? Yes. I'm sorry, you have to speak louder. Sharing your views even if they are different. Well, I would say that in the case of Ibn Khaldun, whenever he did that, he got in trouble in the political courts. However, you could see that he was an ambitious, brave person, that a lot of people, they basically, they get a job, and they, this is the mentality of the, I could say, perhaps my grandfather's generation, which is that if you got a job, then just stay quiet, keep your mouth shut. As long as you're getting a paycheck to be able to sustain your family, just stay in that. So that's why back in those days, people used to be proud that they retired from the same company after 50 years of working there. And these days, that all the young people, if you could do 5 years in a company, that's like considered you're like a dinosaur, because there's such high turnover. Today, people say, well, jump on to something better within a few years, and there's a lot of high turnover. So, but Ibn Khaldun wasn't scared of the consequences of being ambitious. And of course, he achieved success. He also lost at times, but I would say that overall, his success was far greater than his losses. So don't be the one who just sits back and just relaxes, just be comfortable, but rather try to leave a legacy in your life. And Ibn Khaldun did a great job at that. Anybody else? Any brothers? Yes. Yes. Exactly. Jazakallah khair. The singular asset that Ibn Khaldun uses throughout his life and the thing that he passes down to us is the asset of knowledge. Is the asset of knowledge. That studying, learning, and of course there are many different ways of learning. There are different ways of learning. There, you could read books, you could attend classes, and Ibn Khaldun does all of that, but also he uses something which a lot of people don't do, which is to observe what's happening around you and try to observe, okay, you know what's the pattern? What is being repeated again and again? And of course, if there's a pattern, if you want to maintain that pattern, then you need to make sure that everything that is required in order to maintain it is there. And if you want to break it, you may need to just remove one element from that pattern, and that pattern will break, if that's what you want to do. So, if you remember that before the 2016 election, there was a researcher by the name of Nate Silver, I think his name was, and he basically was the first person, well before anything looked real, he said that Donald Trump is going to win. And he basically had a criteria of a number of different points, and he said that if these elements are there, then the challenger is going to win. And it turned out to be very accurate, because basically there was but a lot of internal grumblings in the country, and that's what the challenger takes advantage of. So anyways, basically he was able to see the pattern and he was able to write it down, and Ibn Khaldun did a lot of that for us, which is basically he studied a lot of patterns from previous writings and from his own time, and he left us a huge treasure that we can all benefit from today. Now, the Al-Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun is of course available. Originally it's in Arabic, but it has been translated, and it is said that when the French came to Tunis and Tunisia, they were having a lot of problems with conquering and subjugating the Berbers. So one of the French generals, he said, bring the book of Ibn Khaldun and translate it so that we can understand who these people are. He said, we need to understand who these people are, so bring the book of Ibn Khaldun and translate it, and whatever lessons that they could have learned from that, that's what basically allowed them in their conquest of that region. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all of the good that Ibn Khaldun did, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive any mistakes that he might have made, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the same for all of us as well. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Inshallah, we have about 30 minutes left, so that's time that we can all use to socialize, and inshallah after Salat al-Isha we will have Salat